Is that,
yeah,
does that make us two?
Oh, yeah.
Turn it off again.
So I like it. So that's kind of.
No, that's too dark, but you can't shut that main. Shut that, let's do. Okay, yeah, that's perfect.
I like the lights a little lower for my eyes.
So we wanted to cover one type of certified assurances that are in VOCA or VAWA or SAS grant, or in all three. At every SWAVO, since a lot of people that attend SWAVO have a grant, federal grant through our office. So we're going to be covering the rape crisis counselor mandate, as well as this is in the statute, as well as within certified assurances in the grant. Go to the next slide. So to kind of start off with that, is to really understand the difference between confidentiality versus privilege. That green is extra bright on this TV. So, but really confidentiality does come from statutory law. And it's written that in statute what confidentiality should look like. Confidentiality versus privilege, the confidentiality is describing the relationship that you have with that you have a confidential relationship. And privilege is that it's protected communication to some degree. So privileged communications are statements or conversations where you have assured confidentiality. So in advocacy world, essentially, everyone has a slightly different confidentiality depending on what organization you're under. If you're under a government organization such as a county attorney's office, a law enforcement agency, and you're an advocate with that, you don't have the level of confidentiality that a community-based program may have that's under a domestic violence shelter. So with that, you're as a system-based, you're obligated, and it's in the statute it has that you shall give the communications you have with the victim to the prosecutor that are exculpatory or pertinent to the case, essentially. With community-based programs, so that's under nonprofit agencies like domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers. There's legal agencies that are nonprofit. You have that you only need to disclose confidential communications or information if it's under the mandatory reporting laws. So like December had mentioned, she's a mandatory reporter, which all under that are. And it would be that you have to report any child abuse. So if the child witnesses domestic violence as well. And then if you have reported to you elder abuse or abuse of a disabled or vulnerable adult, or if they are suicidal, making that they're a threat to themselves or a threat to others, so suicide or homicidal threats. So that's the difference there. With privilege, we're going to talk about this more in depth, but with sexual assault counselors, those that have gone through and are certified under the 40-hour training to be a sexual assault counselor, they have privileged communication. And so they still are mandatory reporters, but they have that additional layer where they can't be subpoenaed or things like that, and that's a privileged communication. You do have to be working on with that under a rape crisis center, so what an agency that is providing sexual assault specific services. So you can go to the next slide.
So sorry, there's a lot of words on these slides. There's a lot of words with me too, so apologize for that. I do have one cute little meme at the end though, so there we go. Just hold on tight for that. But you know, we're all on pins and needles. So this is important to know that we're kind of going to be talking about two different things, but they're really closely the same, but just we want people to understand that there is a certified assurance as part of our grant. So if you or your program receive a grant from our office from VOCA, VAWA, or SAS, then obviously you need to abide by the certified assurances. But the certified assurance itself refers back to a state statute. So even if you're not covered on our grants, there's still the statute there. But it's just the certified assurance is kind of putting the extra up that you also need to do this for the grants. So in the certified assurance, And some of you might know this, actually, all of you should know this if you're a sub-grantee, because you better be reading your certified assurances, right? You know, all 50 pages of that really super excited reading. But there is a page in there that talks about the rape crisis counselor mandate. So first of all, do know that this is only applicable to nonprofit organizations. So if you are working for a prosecutor's office or a children's justice center or any type of non-nonprofit, I guess, government organization, right? Then this will not apply to you. A lot of people will still sign it. It's okay, you know, we don't hold it against you. It's just doesn't really apply to you, because like Vicki just said, you wouldn't really have that privilege, but you're welcome to sign it. You're welcome to attend a rape crisis counselor training. I'm so glad that Liliana's here from UCASA, because then if we go astray and say something, she can be like, that's not how that goes. So please feel free to jump in. But you know, system-based advocates are of course always welcome to attend these trainings. I attended myself a dozen years ago and it was fantastic, and I know it still is, but you just wouldn't have that privilege. So just keeping that in mind. So under our certified assurance, and this is just word for word what it says in our certified assurances, the Utah Office of Victims of Crime requires all nonprofit organizations receiving grant funding who provide rape crisis services to certify their compliance with Confidential Communications for Sexual Assault Act, Utah State Judicial Code 77. All sub-grantee staff and volunteers who provide services, direct services to victims of sexual violence must complete 40 hours of training in assisting victims of sexual assault. Training to certify as a rape crisis counselor must be provided by a Utah Rape Crisis Program or a state sexual assault coalition. We only have one state sexual assault coalition, which is UCASA, Confidential Communications for Sexual Assault Act, and then we refer to the code. So pretty much if you are a nonprofit service provider and you provide services to victims of sexual assault, you will need to go to this training and receive that.
And it's all staff that do that.
Yeah, and any staff that provide those services or could provide services to victims of sexual assault, and volunteers. So you could have volunteers answer the crisis line. If it's a crisis line where sexual assault victims may be calling in, you know, any staff or volunteers answering their crisis line need to receive this training. If you provide other services, maybe you provide services to tribal victims or deaf victims or any victims that are sexual assault victims, you would need to receive this training, okay?
And within 90 days of getting your grant.
Yeah, within 90 days. Now, if you need an exception to that 90 days, you're more than welcome to reach out to any of your reach out to your grant analyst is usually the best way to do that. Just because we do know that UCASA can't be providing the training every week. I mean, I know Liliana really wants to do that, but obviously their staff and resources are limited as well. And sometimes, you know, with getting new people hired and getting them trained, it doesn't always work. So if there's some problems with that, just reach out to your grant analyst, and that can be, you know, we can look at making an exception to that rule. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to go into the statute. Like I said, that was the certified assurance. This is the statute. We'll be talking about this for a while. Like I said, so this really, the statute really only covers those rape crisis centers, which we'll define in just 1 second. But if you are a government-based advocate, this is still really great information to know. You know, who does have this, just know that the confidential communications for sexual assault does not apply to you in your role. But it's still really good to know who it applies to in your community, so you can know who to send them to if they need that confidential counselor. Okay. I wanted to go to this first part though, because it's just kind of an overview, but I really liked reading the purpose of it, because I think we always need to go back to our work. We have, especially grants and, you know, policies, There's a lot of rules, words, things like that. Sometimes you get locked up in those, and I really like the reason why. When, you know, for example, and we're not specifically talking about confidentiality in general today, but you know, we have a lot of trainings around confidentiality, and sometimes those can be kind of a little bit, you know, tense when you're working with other service providers. So like, why can't you just tell me this information? And then you're like, oh, it's a little bit awkward, you know. And you can always say, and you're always welcome to throw our program or state statute under the bus, which is really nice to do. Oh, that means Tally, you'll be seen. Says we have to do this, and we signed a grant. Let's say we have to do this, and that's great because we're happy to do that, and that's kind of part of our role. However, the purpose isn't necessarily because Tally said so, although I'd love to see that in state statute one day. You know, that really the reason why these were established, and how, for example, the Violence Against Women Confidentiality Act is established, is for the safety and the well-being of the victims involved, you know. And so if you know, have some people being like, why do you have to do this? What are the rules around that? Like going back to, oh yeah, this is for safety. You know, when I worked in direct services, there were a couple of very scary moments, you know, when I worked in domestic violence shelter of abusers looking for their victims, posing to be whoever else, police officers or anybody else. And, you know, the easier option would have been like, oh yeah, here's the information, when that is not okay. And there were reasons why these were established for victim safety. So even though sometimes it's like, you have to follow these rules, there are good reasons. So there's my little soapbox, just had to get out of it for a second. So state statute says, it is the purpose of this act to enhance and promote the mental, physical, and emotional recovery of victims of sexual assault. I knew that was the, you know, full purpose of this, to promote mental, physical, and emotional recovery of sexual assault, and to protect information given by victims of sexual assault counselors from being disclosed. And so it's not just promoting, you know, the confidentiality so that you could be a privileged communicator when those conversations are being had, but also to promote the mental, physical, and emotional recovery of victims, that knowing that there is a place that they can go to, that they can speak to someone confidentially, that this person under law cannot, you know, cannot dispose of this information. And there's a great amount of safety in that for someone who's just been raped. I think that's important to remember that, you know, you just went through probably the most horrible jail in your entire life, and you really don't want that to be getting out anywhere. You know, there are places that you can go that are completely confidential, and I think that's really powerful. So just taking a pause to recognize that, and then we can go on. So definitions, now this is the fun wordy part. But I do always like to, you know, I'm a kind of a policy geek, but I do like to kind of hammer in on the wording of these definitions, because when it really gets down to the nitty gritty and you're looking at legislation, or any attorney might try to bring that back up to you, you really have to hone in on what these words and what those might mean. And that definitely a lot of people could interpret them in different ways. Now, there was some legislation that was proposed in the last session by Representative Romero to change, just to make a few changes to this statute. However, unfortunately, and that was going right through, it just did not get through the legislature in time. So we have gone back to the original wording. I'm sure that's probably going to be brought up again next session, right, Liana? But for right now, so if you saw some other things come out, they're probably very legit, and they looked good in all of the committees and whatnot. They just did not get through in time. So just know that that's probably going to be coming up again. We might be back a year from now saying, hey, this changes a little bit, so here you go. But right now, this is what it is. Okay, so confidential communication means information given to a sexual assault counselor by a victim, and includes reports or working papers made in the course of the counseling relationship. So obviously that could be any kind of meetings you've had with them, information given to you specifically, right? If other people were involved with that, only your part could be confidential. You know, so for example, if the victim said something in front of you and a detective wouldn't have that same level of confidentiality, but you would. And then of course, working papers or anything like that. I don't know. Rape Crisis Center. Now, this is a question that comes up a lot. As it stands right now, the definition of Rape Crisis Center for this particular statute is any office, institution, or center assisting victims of sexual assault and their families, which offers crisis intervention, medical and legal services, and counseling. Okay, so if you are any of those, then you would fall under Rape Crisis Center, even if that might not be specifically your title. If you're offering victims of sexual assault those services, that's where you fall. Well, good. Any questions? Anything online up until now? All right, cool. Save your questions for Vicky. Just kidding. Okay.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yes, boss.
She likes me to answer the
I just
questions.
just know so much more than me on this. Usually I answer a question and someone tells me later, that wasn't the right answer. I'm like, oh, right. Now I gotta go back and tell everybody. Sexual assault counselor. Now, also keeping in mind, and because of these definitions here, the word counselor can mean so many things. When I hear counselor, I usually think of like a therapist, right? And that's not necessarily the exact definition in here. So just keep that in mind that it's like, I'm not a counselor, I'm a therapist. I mean, I'm an advocate, I don't have a bachelor's degree. Well, that might not be the definition for this purpose, okay? For here, it means a person who is employed by or volunteers at a rape crisis center who has a minimum of the 40 hours of training and in counseling and assisting victims of sexual assault, and who's under the supervision of a director or designee of a rape crisis center. So we just established what a rape crisis center is. Now it's a sexual assault counselor. So like we said, this really could be a volunteer answering the crisis line. If that volunteer is trained on the 40 hours of training that we specified earlier, and under the supervision of the director of a rape crisis center or the designee. So obviously you don't have to go directly under the director, especially if it's a large organization, but maybe it's like a program manager that reports to the director, okay? So that could be the volunteers at the crisis line, it could be a hospital response team, it could be a therapist, and their roles, it could be a victim advocate, it could be a case manager, it could be a lot of those people. And a victim, this one's probably the most straightforward, means a person who's experienced sexual assault or whatever nature, including incest, rape, and requests counseling or assistance regarding the mental, physical, and emotional consequences of sexual assault.
Sorry, this one's lots of words. So this kind of is more outlining exceptions to the confidential communications, essentially. So, and then it does also outline that institutional advocacy services, they have their own confidential communications act for institutional, so under universities. So this isn't outlining those, it's outlining under the Sexual Assault Confidential Communication Act. So saying that the communication between a victim and a sexual assault counselor is available to a third person, so to another party. In these incidences, if the victim's a minor and the counselor believes it's in the best interest of the victim to disclose the confidential communication to the victim's parents. So having that has to be like that it's going to be in their best interest. You are still obligated, if it's a minor, that they're reporting a sexual offense, to report that to DCFS or law enforcement, but to have it be a communication and involvement of the parents, it would need to be in the best interest and have that the victim is aware of that. Or if the victim's a minor and the minor parent or guardian have consented to the disclosure of the communication to another third party based on the representations made, and it's in the best interest. So maybe if there is a doctor involved in the case on a minor or something like that, that would need to be aware of this traumatic incident, or there's another third party outside of that counselor, maybe it's a therapist, so they're the sexual assault counselor, an advocate that has that title, but there's a therapist that would need to be involved. So it would be with the consent of both the parent and the minor. When the victim's not a minor but has given consent, for the count, and the counselor believes the disclosure is necessary to accomplish the desired result of counseling, or the counselor has an obligation under mandatory reporting to report the information. Essentially, that's what the code is it's reference back to DCFS's codes for mandatory reporting. So if they're an adult, it can be, if you're working with a victim of sex offense and you have, and the copies of the presentations are on the Google Drive. Or not on.
It will be.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it will be added to the Google Drive that Maddie shared a link to. Sorry, I just saw it pop up, so I wanted to answer that while it popped up before I forgot. In regards to the disclosure to other third parties, when the victim's not a minor, this can be where you're working as an advocate of a community-based program under a rape crisis center, and then that's going to be in the best interest to be working also with the system-based advocate to have that there's an information and release signed so that you can work with both parties, or maybe you need to be working with another agency to make sure they're getting connected to those resources. And then, yeah, the last one is you still fall under mandatory reporting. So is there any questions on the exceptions of confidential communications? They're fairly straightforward.
Exciting topic.
I know.
I love it. Personally, but-
Really.
I'm pretty sure everyone always paid in just for the service.
Vicky,
Yeah.
Vicky,
Go ahead, Kelly. Yeah.
yeah, I just, so this just came up. One of my interns said that in class, they were strictly taught that if they're working with an adult who discloses childhood sexual abuse, that they are mandated to report that. And that is not what I understood. So I want to make sure that if they're an adult and were abused as children and they do not give consent, I mean, that's something that they would report on their own. That's not, and I'm correct, right? That's what we've always thought. So I feel the need to maybe find out of what's going on with the school. So, because he explicitly told them that. So, yeah, that's a concern.
A little kind of blurred, because if someone reports child sexual abuse as an adult, but that adult may still be around children, then, and about it, then that would be a mandate.
So Liliana said that it's blurry in some incidences.
Right.
Sorry, I didn't know if you could hear. So yeah, if
Barely,
it's an adult,
but yeah.
if they're an adult and they disclose child sexual abuse and that they're working around other children, you're still mandated to report, just because of that.
Exactly.
That organization could then put other children in danger if they have.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do understand that was not, I mean, he was not being explicit about that. He was just saying any kind of abuse you need to report. So yeah. Okay.
I wouldn't think so, because I think it would be under them. See, when you say me hearing that, I don't want to go off.
My understanding has been what yours is, Kelly, as
Yeah,
well. Other than if they are working specifically with children, then it should still be reported.
That would be more of a duty to warn, I would think, too.
Right.
Oh, we call it outline just to get,
And
clarity. Yeah.
you could call the DCFS hotline as well to clarify if there is ever question on if that person should have it reported.
Yeah.
Is
Thank
the
you.
recommendation. Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Is there any other questions?
So can you reiterate what you were saying is if they were an adult and sexually assaulted as a child? There was a lot of back and forth, so I'd like a little clarification.
Sure, yeah, Nancy, that's no problem. So if they are an adult and reporting past child sexual abuse, it's a little more blurry in that it's not mandated to report that. But if they are working with children, or that they're going to be around children, you still have a duty to warn that victimization could put other children at risk because of that. So you are still obligated to report that. But if you ever have questions on what you should or shouldn't report, you can call DCFS's hotline.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Is there any other questions? Okay. So I know everyone loves scenarios, but with this, I think it's good to kind of just bring in. Sorry, is there another comment?
No, it was okay. Yeah.
The refuge just says, it sounds like if there is real and imminent threat of continued abuse, you need to report.
Yes.
Someone working at daycare, for example.
Okay, so with this, I like scenarios just because you can think of how does this apply, because you hear this mandate, you hear the statute, and then when you get back to your office, like, okay, how does this apply to this situation? So that's why I like to do scenarios, so you can kind of think outside the box too, what works. So in our scenario, you have Sarah, who is a 19-year-old college student and was raped by her boyfriend at her dorm. And I like dormitory, Tally had to put that in. And went to her doctor 2 days later seeking birth control options. Upon learning of the rape, her doctor referred her to the emergency room for a code R exam. At the code R exam, a SANE nurse, law enforcement victim advocate from law enforcement, and then a hospital response team advocate responded to the hospital in that call. Sarah consents to the exam with the SANE nurse doing that and to having the hospital response advocate present during the exam. The detective and police advocate provide her with information and set a time to meet with her at a later date and leave. The following day, she meets with both the detective and the advocate and files a police report. She then goes to her local rape crisis center and meets with the case manager for resources and counseling. So who's involved in this case? Either if this case came into you, who could be involved? What agencies, what programs,
Feel
what
free to
advocates?
shout it out or put it in the chat.
She's reporting, so assistant-based advocacy.
Mhm. Yep.
But she's going to the rape crisis center, so there's going to be the community-based advocacy,
Yeah, so system-based advocate and community-based advocate, exactly.
law enforcement.
Law enforcement. The doctors, the SANE nurse, right, medical, who else? Therapist potentially. What else would be involved?
Yeah.
Defendant,
The
victim and
rapist
defendant, yeah.
Hopefully should be involved.
Depending on the institution, the Title IX office.
There you go, yeah, I was waiting for that.
Put some tricky stuff in there.
Yeah, so the institute, because it was, and if the college had, so we didn't specify in our scenario, Title IX office, yeah, thanks Cassidy. That since it's happened on campus and if there is campus police, then that could be the police agency that's involved, but then there could be the Title IX office involved or the counseling center, the women's center at the university.
The RA at the dorm.
Could have that, right? So who's covered of all those people working, who's covered under the confidential communications for sexual assault act?
The rape crisis.
Yeah, the hospital response team advocate and then the rape crisis center, right? Is there anyone else?
Is Title IX under that?
They have their own. Yeah, so they're under confidential communications of an institutional advocacy. Yep, but it's very similar to
Yeah.
the sexual assault.
And that's another, we can put that, that's in the PowerPoint, I believe. We just didn't really go over that today because it's not necessarily nurse certified assurance, but it's a whole other thing of what colleges have as far as their privilege.
Yeah.
And Title IX and here's another thing too, this probably was university police too.
Right.
So it's just a whole other ball of wax. So, and they all have even rape crisis counselor centers on campus. And depending on what department they're under on campus.
Depends on their
Oh
confidentiality.
goodness, we've had a lot of conversations around that.
So if you have an advocate that's under the campus police department, they would become under a system-based confidentiality. But if you had like an advocacy program that's under maybe the counseling center or a women's center, they would have the institutional confidential communications, which is very similar to a sexual assault counselor communication. So that's where it can get really kind of confusing, right? So we have all of those, different parties responded in some way. What agencies would essentially need to sign the certified assurance of those that are working with this victim?
The rape crisis center.
Right, yeah.
With the HRT advocate.
And usually those are under that rape crisis center. So yeah, they would need to be under that.
Title IX. Would they sign that or no?
No.
Because they have their own confidentiality.
Yep, exactly. But what would be beneficial in this so that you can have a collaborative effort in working with the sexual assault? Signed release, right? And having that, that information, you know, and having it be what specifically there. If you have your information and releases too vague, that can open the victim up for potential problems down the road when it comes to the criminal part of the case and things like that. So having what can be shared and having that the victim is the one signing that, right, and very informed in when they're signing that. Yeah, so I think with this, it's like one of those that there's so many people that can be involved and that can become really confusing for the victim. And so really explaining your confidentiality up front is really important with sexual assault. And what's the benefit of having that the hospital response team is the advocate in the room instead of the system-based advocate?
Report something they don't want to go into the case.
Yeah.
You know, like the data drug or something, you know, like
Mhm.
just so they did, you know, the system-based advocate doesn't have to.
They have a little more control of what's given to the detective, right?
Refuge says confidentiality.
Confidentiality, right? They have more confidentiality. And in this case, it's a 19-year-old, right? So we have that she's an adult, so there's not the minor. One other area we said who could be involved is our office, right? Crime victims reparations. We forgot our own office in this. So we have reparations as well that could be involved in maybe making sure her roommates don't know or they do know if she wants them to. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so as crisis advocacy is system-based, I've been called out to the hospital. Law enforcement's not there. They do not want to report. They were drinking, there were drugs involved. I don't have to report those things, so I don't understand what the difference would be between system-based and community-based in that scenario. Like, what would be, why is that such a better benefit than crisis?
So if you were to get a court subpoena, you would have to go as a system-based advocate and
But the crime
testify.
hasn't been reported, they don't want to report. So I give them all of the information that they need.
Yeah, for sure.
Them with every link, everything possible, and continue to work with them.
Absolutely.
I'm not bound by, if you do not follow this through, I can't work with you.
Oh, no, you should definitely, yeah.
So we're able to follow people through, but we also don't have to report those crimes. So I'm confused.
So if you had there's still, the state nurse has an obligation, they have to get a case number from law enforcement for that exam. So that still gets technically a report with that case number. And so because they're getting a case report, whether the victim is going to be working and having law enforcement come in because you're under law enforcement or under that system, you would need to give that to the detective or the officer that gets the initial report, even if they don't have that they're going to go forward with it.
It's just you wouldn't have the same privilege as if they did choose to go for it.
So if they are telling you that
Yeah.
they did use drugs and things like that, because you're under that system, you're obligated, because they still have to get a case number at the very minimum to attach to the report, unless it's a restricted case, a restricted kit, and that's the only one that does not get a law enforcement case number attached to it. Because the law enforcement is the one that takes the kit and sends it to the crime lab. So only time that they don't do that is restricted case kits. And those are the only ones that don't have any law enforcement involvement at all. So those would be the only ones that you wouldn't necessarily do that.
I would also add that survivors change their mind all the time.
Yeah.
Right, so if at first they say, no, I don't want to report, but then they change their mind a little later, you now become an impact witness to the investigation. They told you about the assault, so you become a witness to that case. So, you know, kind of going back with what Tally was saying, it's always kind of considering the safety of the survivor and what's best. And that privileged communication is really essential for that survivor. And that when somebody else kind of steps in, that's obsolete, that's gone, right, for that survivor. And they don't know that, but we as system or community-based advocates do know that, and we have to do right by the survivor and just ensure that all of those privileges that are set up to protect the survivors
And it's really beneficial for the victim to have both. Like I would still respond as a system-based advocate to the hospital if the officers asked me to introduce myself, know that I'm helping with that. And then I would step out for the exam, and the hospital response team could be in for the exam because there's things that they may say while they're getting the exam done to the nurse that they didn't have in their mind that they wanted that to go to law enforcement. And so that's kind of that difference. It's not negating the importance of both advocacy programs being there. It's really just kind of protection of for the victim during that exam when they make excited utterances during the exam and things like that. That's what officers rely on while they're all the defendants in the back of the car, right, is to make those excited utterances. So that's the main reason, is it's not that your service isn't going to be valuable. It's just for that piece while they're in that. So it's really could be a good way to have a warm handoff, is that they know you can be connected and you're a soft side of the police department or soft side of the court process, and can educate them on this is what it could look like to, report, do an interview, and really explain that process so there can be less fear maybe with it, and know that they have a support through that process, but they also have this support arm that can help them with therapy or group or counseling or other resources that are all fully confidential. Does that make sense?
Angie's point too, if this is the point you're making, I don't know, that, in some areas, I'm really happy we're out here in Vernal today. I do love Vernal, by the way. It's just such a fun little place. And there's not always the same amount and level of advocacy and support that there's going to be in Utah County or Salt Lake County, that, hey, this is what we got, and so it's such a hard, and we'll talk definitely more tomorrow. So I hope everybody here can come tomorrow and have more discussion around needs and gaps and services, because I've seen on both ends. I've heard advocates in larger counties being like, there's kind of too many of us here, not in a bad way, but like, who's doing this and who's doing this? We don't want to step on each other's toes. And then in places where there's not quite as many, it's kind of like, oh, I'm kind of wearing a few different hats here. And the trickier part is, it really is important that the victim is, they've just been raped. They have had everything taken from them, right? The last thing we want to do is take away more of their knowledge and consent. While at the same time, though, they are not in a place to understand what advocate is doing what and what form is doing what. Like, who would want to think through, who can think through that at that time? So you kind of have to walk that balance between, a lot of system-based advocates. I think it's great too that you have that support in your office to be able to still provide victims who choose not to go forward with reporting and charging. So, yeah, you know what, we're still going to serve you no matter what. That's what we're here to do. At the same time, knowing that, hey, this is kind of our role. So I really admire everybody here too for recognizing that, hey, we're doing the best we can with the services that are available.
Yeah, and I know that it's hard to keep hospital response teams like advocates trained and ready to go out and things like that too. So it's still gonna, if there aren't community-based programs that can go out, it's still beneficial for the victim to have an advocate that they at least can connect with. Just know that that's what you're removing if you're a system-based advocate.
But I do think it's important to tell the victim that you're not completely confidential, because we've had it like, oh, I had no idea. I said all of these things.
Yeah.
And that the same nurse can be called up to testify, because Wasatch forensic nurses, they will let a victim know that if you have any questions that you want to just stay right here, I can make the room, or I can give you some time with your hospital response advocate.
So when I was in Duchesne County, I was doing crisis. I was system-based, and that was the same thing. I was the only at that time. And then we prosecuted, but we were in crisis. So we did the same thing. We would follow them through, but if they had something they wanted to say, we could step out of the room if they wanted us to.
Exactly.
That's great. Yeah.
That's perfect.
But the first thing we did was say, you need to understand that I am a system-based advocate. You share with me, I can share with law enforcement and the prosecutor.
Yeah.
So that was something that we had to do up front.
Yeah.
That first word out of our mouth was that. So
Yeah, and
That's really
I mean, that it's probably not gonna be a blur, but absolutely to get the consent. And Vicky, in a lot of her travels, I won't disclose who, but it was a rural county, not here, where the county attorney said to Vicky, yeah, but I really do want my advocate there in the room. And Vicky was very professional and kind, was like, that's not your call though, that's the victim's call, you know, because they might not necessarily know that that advocate, you know, because he trusts this advocate, he wants them to work with them, but, you know, that once again is taking that away from the victim, right here.
I was just gonna point out that we're the crisis call out response team for this area. And that is the procedure that we follow. We talk to the victim and let them make that decision. If we as a system-based advocate, we disclose our role, this is what we do. And then now we have the opportunity to do that stand up. We have community-based advocacy. So it's been a nice option to offer them. And sometimes they choose to do that, sometimes they don't. And we still try to educate them because they don't fully understand what that even means at that time.
Right.
So that's kind of how we worked it out the last. that I've been around, so.
That's great. I love that. I think Nancy, you had a comment or a question?
No.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I just saw that you unmuted or something.
There was a question about, is a restricted kid still done by a same nurse?
Yes.
Yes.
And I think Utah has like the lowest percentage of restricted kids. And I think the education piece with that community versus system has really come a long way, and kind of educating them on what that means to restrict it, that they can unrestrict it, but they have to go to the law enforcement agency to unrestrict it. So the sexual assault nurse examiner restricts it. And now I can't remember the kids. Is it who holds the kid though?
Law
Law enforcement still holds the kid, it's just restricted, right?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I thought it went straight to the crime
It
lab,
does
right?
with their crime lab.
Okay. Yeah. It just goes to the crime lab, but isn't processed for restricted kids. Okay, yeah, you go this slide.
We'll wrap up.
So this is your meme that Tally was referencing.
Yay.
Let me explain. There's too much.
Let me see.
So really that confidential communication for Sexual Assault Act, to have that privileged communication, they do have to receive the 40-hour rape crisis training, and then have that certification to be a sexual assault counselor, be employed at a rape crisis center, and be under the supervision of the director or a designee of the rape crisis center. And then they still have to abide by mandatory reporting laws. So that's kind of have that confidential communication, that privilege. You have to have those. Do you want to add anything, Luana? Sorry, you look like you wanted to. So, okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Yes, so, Friends Against Family Violence, we serve Tri-County. Right now, we're just a domestic violence program. We're not a rape crisis center. If we became a rape crisis center and had an advocate trained in that, is there an issue with us having a 24/7 crisis line that's just for domestic violence, and then also having a separate advocate that can provide sexual assault services? Does that make sense?
Have we asked Liliana? I'm just gonna over there.
The way the statute is written is pretty broad, so essentially, like Victor was saying, anybody who has a program that serves victims could have a rape crisis program. Now, we are really concerned about that because there's a lot of random organizations that are popping up and starting their own, so-called rape crisis programs. And so we will be working on legislation to change some of the language so that it is clear who falls under a rape crisis center, and setting up standards of care for survivors of sexual assault, because what we've seen.
Hang on, actually, can we pause
Can you come
for a
closer
second?
to the mic?
Because the interpreters and the people online are having a hard time hearing. So would you mind repeating the question and then going back to what you
No,
said?
you repeat the question.
Okay, repeat the question and then come on up.
Can everyone hear me from?
I think they can hear you. But
Okay,
it's just.
so the question is that we are currently a domestic violence shelter and crisis line program with community-based advocacy, but we do not have anyone that's done the 40-hour training. We don't have any grants or anything to provide sexual assault services. If we have one of our community-based advocates, we get funding, we do the 40-hour training where they can provide services, is that a conflict that we have a 24/7 crisis line? We would have folks answering a crisis line for domestic violence, but we would also, you know, it's how do we communicate that? I just don't know if we have the capacity to do both. And yeah, that's kind of the question.
Okay, so the question is, sorry, I guess I couldn't hear you very well, is with their program, it's a domestic violence specific program, and it's a community-based program. They do have a crisis line, so if they were down the road to add an advocate that could be trained and receive the 40-hour training as a rape crisis, a sexual assault counselor, but they don't have the crisis line staff trained that way, is that going to be a conflict or an issue? Did I sum it up okay? All right.
I mean, I think there's a two-part issue, but for the rape crisis, under that statute currently, you could, you know, train somebody, apply for funding, and have a rape crisis advocate in your organization. What we are looking to change is ensuring that there are rape crisis standards, so that programs who are running rape crisis centers now also have a standard of care, a threshold that they need to meet in order to provide meaningful sexual assault services. Because what we're seeing is that at times when we're working with a DV victim, we think, oh, and it's sexual assault too, and then it's really, you know, messy. So that's the part of it. The other part of it is that we will be looking at changing what the definition of rape crisis center is, because it's so broad right now. And what we've seen is that people are starting up their own organizations or so-called nonprofits and are charging, you know, thousands of dollars to victims so that they can get coaching sessions. They can get all, you know, all of these different, you know, support services for an astronomical cost, where we know that there is access to services for free, you know, for survivors. So that's the other piece. Now, if you have a DV hotline, if you're getting specific funding for DV hotline, and now it becomes a sexual assault, and it's, you know, that would be a funder question, you know, for me. I would not use that DV hotline for a sexual side. I'd probably have to start another sexual assault hotline specific for that funding, but that's more of a funder question.
And to answer that, for the funder perspective, we would probably say that anybody in your organization that could come into contact with a sexual assault victim, like, you know, volunteer answering that crisis line, they might come in, they would need to receive that training, you know, that 40-hour training.
What if they don't have the staff capacity to have it with that training? We're very small. Just wouldn't be able to do.
We bring the 40-hour training here every year.
Right.
Put them all on insurance. So you use micro.
Yeah.
So we're like, there's like 5 of them.
They can't hear. So the question
Okay,
is,
yeah.
sorry, and we're gonna wrap up here, but the question is if they didn't have the staff capacity to really have everyone trained because they're a small organization. And I think that you can have, it's really to have that you're trying to receive that training in a timely manner, but it doesn't mean that like everyone has to be trained right away, but have at least that they would have a base knowledge. And then to be that sexual assault counselor that receives that privilege, you would want to have that they have the 40-hour, but they should have a base, like at least knowledge of what the response is and how crisis should look like for sexual assault at the beginning, and then have the expectation that maybe within the year they're getting that training, or, you know, staggering.
Well, and we've heard that. We think that that's a burden to a lot of agencies, right? If you're only a one system-based advocate, tell us and say like, hey, go spend 40 hours, you know, it's not necessarily manageable. So we are looking at what we can do online, what can be onboarding, what can be videos, what can be mentoring. So those are all things. So we are hearing, we know about the training burden, and we agree. None of us put the 40-hour into law, but it is what we have to work with. And personally, I feel like that's such a minimum hour that it's not long enough, but I don't know how to increase it without the burden as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of double-edged sword.
And we're gonna, I think that ours last slide, just our information.
They do offer the 40-hour training online right now. That's how we've been getting ours.
Yeah, UCASA does a monthly training that like they have one every month.
Yeah.
And right now it is virtual. If they do have a limited slots, wow. Whew. So just slots, yeah. Just because it takes away from the meaningfulness of the training if it's too large. So that's something I know there's been waiting lists and things like that. But
Yeah, and we just shifted things so that you're only prioritizing for the 40-hour system and community-based victim advocates. Because we have a lot of community members who want to take it, and it's just like, you don't really need this, so we're gonna offer another training for them so that the 40-hour is just for system.
yeah, so Liliana just was saying that they have right now just prioritized for their 40-hour for system-based and community-based advocacy because they've had a lot of just community members wanting to take it, but they've kind of had them doing it separate, not the full 40-hour. So yeah, and then we're transition over. to
Yeah,
Mike.
so thank you, Vicki and Tally. I like that we've been doing the certified assurances part in here. I'm really big on like schedules and flow, and this next presentation doesn't necessarily fit into the flow of it. It's coming ahead of time for your resources.